What if the most photographed century in history began with cities no one remembers building, and no one was there to live in them? Imagine Paris without Parisians, Chicago's streets stretching for miles under a haze of smoke and dust, every window open, every door waiting, yet not a single figure in sight. Across the Atlantic, St. Petersburg's canals mirror empty bridges, and in America's new metropolises like San Francisco and Philadelphia, the photographers of the late 1800s captured silence so profound it feels unearthly. We call them the empty cities of the 19th century, an archive of ghostly streets that should be teeming with life, but aren't. To historians, it's a technical issue. Early cameras required long exposures, and moving people simply vanished. But the more one examines these images, the less the explanation fits. Some scenes lasted minutes of exposure, yet not even a blur crosses the cobblestones. Windows remain open, but unlit. Fountains run, but no caretaker stands near. Entire avenues appear as if paused mid-construction or after an evacuation. It is as though civilization had taken a breath and forgot to exhale. The official narrative tells us the 19th century was the great march of progress. Steam, electricity, factories, and cities booming with life. Yet beneath that story runs another melody, a pattern of fires, rebuildings, missing populations, and architecture too grand for its time. Some have begun to call this the trace of a great reset, an event, or series of events, that quietly wiped the slate of the old world and set the stage for ours. When we look closely, a strange symphony emerges. Each city, each photograph, each abandoned palace is a note in a buried composition. We can almost hear its echo in the stonework. Arches too precise, columns too ancient to be new. Who wrote this music of marble and steel? And why was it silenced so completely? Our journey begins amid the smoke of the Industrial Revolution, between the ruins of old Europe and the rising skyline of America. It is a world balanced between memory and amnesia, where the maps are familiar, but the timelines refuse to align. We will trace the evidence that connects the great fires of the 1800s to the mud flood legends and to the world's fairs. Those impossible exhibitions that sprang from nowhere and vanished overnight. Every brick tells a story, and every gap in the record hums like a missing note. Together, they suggest that our history may not be as linear as we think. Perhaps we are standing on the layered remains of an earlier civilization, a Tartarian world reset by catastrophe, and then carefully rewritten into the chronicles we learned at school. In the chapters to come, we'll walk those empty streets and listen for the forgotten melody still vibrating beneath them. We'll examine the architecture that shouldn't exist, the technologies that appeared too soon, and the photographs that should be impossible. Step by step, we'll collect the notes of this buried symphony and ask the question few dare to utter aloud. Was the 19th century a continuation of history, or a restart after its erasure? So before you get too comfortable, remember, sometimes the truth is not lost in time. It's simply buried beneath our feet. To understand the mystery of the empty cities, we first have to step back into what we're told was one of the most vibrant and expanding centuries in human history. The 19th century, according to every textbook, was an age of unstoppable progress. Steamships stitched continents together. Telegraph wires hummed across oceans, populations exploded, industry roared, and cities rose like monuments to human ambition. From London to St. Petersburg, from New York to Paris, the narrative is one of movement, crowds, factories, workers, children, invention. And yet, when we turn to the actual photographic record, the new technology that was supposed to immortalize this age, we find stillness. Streets empty, plazas silent, buildings immaculate but uninhabited. The first photographs of cityscapes appeared in the 1840s, barely a decade after the invention of the daguerreotype. These early cameras required long exposures, often several minutes, to capture an image. Historians say that any person who moved during that time would simply disappear from the picture, leaving only the stationary architecture behind. It's a convenient explanation, but one that fails under closer scrutiny. In many of these photographs, horses stand motionless, carts remain mid-turn, flags hang without blur. Were these cities truly so still? Or are we witnessing something else entirely? An urban landscape, frozen in the aftermath of something unspoken? Let's take Paris as an example. The 1850s saw Baron Haussmann's sweeping reconstruction of the French capital, carving its medieval core into the grand boulevards we know today. The narrative describes a city in flux, its population bustling and alive, yet the photographic evidence of that very transformation shows an almost clinical emptiness. Perfectly paved avenues, immaculate facades, symmetrical lampposts, and not a soul in sight. It's as if the photographer wandered through a stage set, moments before the actors were called in. Across the Atlantic, the story repeats itself. San Francisco, in the 1860s, allegedly teeming with gold rush migrants and fortune seekers, appears in image after image as deserted. Streets lined with intricate stone and brick buildings, yet eerily clean and untouched, as though freshly built and awaiting occupation. By the 1870s, the Great Chicago Fire would erase nearly the entire city, giving rise to an official narrative of heroic rebuilding. But what if Chicago wasn't merely destroyed and rebuilt? What if it was something inherited, an architectural framework left behind by another age, restored rather than constructed? It was during this same century that something peculiar occurred across multiple continents. A synchronized wave of catastrophic fires and earthquakes. Moscow burned in 1812, its wooden cityscape collapsing in a single week of flames. New York's downtown burned in 1835, Hamburg 1842, San Francisco 1851, Chicago and Peshtigo 1871, the same night, separated by 1,000 miles. These events, viewed in isolation, are tragic coincidences. Seen together, they resemble a pattern of erasure. Cities consumed by fire, their histories reset, their records rewritten. And yet, from those ashes rose structures too vast and ornate to have been built with the tools and manpower officially available at the time. Consider the neoclassical marvels of the late 1800s, the domes, arches, and colossal columns that appeared across Europe and America within a span of only a few decades. According to architectural historians, these were products of a revival movement, inspired by ancient Rome and Greece. But revival of what? The sheer scale of these projects, built supposedly for temporary exhibitions or municipal pride, seems disproportionate to the period's available resources. The World's Fairs are the most glaring example. In 1893, Chicago hosted the Columbian Exposition, a sprawling white city that covered over 600 acres and featured entire districts of marble palaces, domed halls, and monumental fountains. Officially, they were plaster over wood, temporary facades meant to last only a few months. Yet eyewitnesses describe interiors of solid stone, elaborate plumbing systems, electric lighting, and acoustics rivaling cathedrals. After the fair, almost every structure was demolished or mysteriously burned. Few blueprints survive. The same pattern unfolded in Paris, 1889, St. Louis, 1904, and San Francisco, 1915. The world built and destroyed cities within years, calling them exhibitions, as if rehearsing the act of civilization itself. Alongside these architectural anomalies came social mysteries. Between 1854 and 1929, over 200,000 children were shipped across America on what became known as the orphan trains, an unprecedented migration of youth, many with no clear records of origin. Why so many orphans, and where were their parents? The 1870 census reveals abrupt population fluctuations, with entire family records missing or relocated. Some researchers now interpret these as aftershocks of a massive depopulation event, one erased from the historical record, replaced by the comforting story of urbanization. Then there's the mud. In almost every major city from Edinburgh to Istanbul, construction crews in the late 19th century began unearthing buried windows and doors 1 or even 2 stories below modern street level, foundations that were never meant to be underground. Mud flood theorists suggest this was the residue of a global cataclysm that submerged entire cities, later dug out and re-inhabited. Official archaeology calls it gradual sediment buildup from road leveling. But can that explain doorframes buried halfway up their arches across multiple continents, aligned in the same century? Everywhere we look, the 19th century seems to oscillate between invention and amnesia, between creation and erasure. Technologies appear out of nowhere: early electric lighting systems, photographic techniques, pneumatic transport, all hinted at in patents and sketches decades before their supposed invention dates. It's as if humanity was rediscovering knowledge rather than inventing it, piecing together fragments of a civilization that had been reset. If we were to draw a map of anomalies from 1812 to 1910, we would see clusters of unexplained rebuilding, identical architectural styles appearing thousands of miles apart, and recurring disasters wiping city centers clean. The timeline begins to blur. The rhythm feels less like progress, and more like a symphony replayed after an interruption. Each city, a reprise of the same lost refrain. This is where the conventional story begins to falter. History, as it is taught, flows smoothly from cause to effect, from discovery to innovation. But these anomalies hint at discontinuity, as though someone had edited the timeline, inserting a new movement over the remains of an older one. What if the fires were not mere accidents of progress, but mechanisms of cleansing? What if the world's fairs were not celebrations of invention, but unveiling ceremonies, introducing remnants of an older world under the guise of new construction? It's tempting to dismiss such thoughts as fringe speculation, yet the evidence continues to whisper. Photographs that should contain life remain empty. Buildings that should be new look ancient. Streets that should show growth instead reveal excavation. Even the language of the era betrays unease: reconstruction, rebirth, new era. Words used not after progress, but after loss. As we move forward, we'll begin to follow these threads: the fires, the mud, the architecture, and the sudden silences in the historical record, and see how they intertwine. The official story tells us that humanity built forward from primitive beginnings. But perhaps the truth is inverted. We inherited, repurposed, and forgot. The 19th century may not have been our ascent. It may have been our restart. And if that's true, then the empty cities weren't waiting to be built. They were waiting to be remembered. But the strangest clues are yet to come. In the next part, we'll look directly at the evidence, the photographs, the ruins, and the physical impossibilities that force us to question whether our world truly began where our history books say it did. The first time you truly stare into a photograph from the late 1800s, you notice something uncanny. The emptiness is not casual. It's absolute. Wide boulevards, long perspectives, buildings immaculate and fully realized, yet not one trace of motion, not one figure to disturb the silence. The streets of Paris look like theatrical backdrops, the colonnades of St. Petersburg like scale models under glass. You almost expect to hear the click of miniature gears, not the echo of human life. These images, thousands of them scattered across archives and forgotten libraries, form the backbone of what researchers now call the empty city anomaly. Let's begin with the first anomaly, the photographs themselves. Historians assure us that long exposures erased people from the frame. Yet many of these images were taken using improved collodion processes that captured motion far more effectively by the 1860s. Exposure times had dropped to mere seconds, not minutes. A bustling street should leave at least a few blurred figures, a cart mid-turn, a ghostly shadow of movement. But we find none. Instead, we see identical scenes across continents: Venice, Boston, Moscow, all pristine and silent, as though prepared for inspection. What if these were not ordinary photographs of life, but records of aftermath? Snapshots taken during a transition when the cities were not yet truly alive again? The second anomaly concerns architecture. The buildings that dominate these silent photos share a language of symmetry and precision that modern engineers still struggle to replicate. Gigantic arches, domes spanning impossible widths, stone blocks fitted so tightly that no mortar line can be found. The official record insists these were neoclassical revivals, products of a sudden fascination with antiquity. Yet how do so many cities, across cultures, economies, and continents, produce the same architectural style within the same narrow window of decades? No global internet, no multinational design firms, yet the same ornate facades appear from San Francisco to Budapest. Columns of identical proportion, pediments carved with the same motifs. Who was teaching whom? Or were these structures simply restored versions of something older, something uncovered, not invented? The third anomaly appears beneath our feet, the mud flood phenomenon. Across the 19th century, construction workers discovered buried doors, half-submerged windows, and streets several meters below current ground level. Official explanations blame gradual road raising and sedimentation, but the pattern defies that logic. The depth of burial is often uniform across entire districts, as if the cities were drowned in a single layer of silt, later dug out. In St. Petersburg, photographs show buildings with lower windows bricked over under new sidewalks. In Boston and Turin, excavations revealed lower streets, perfectly preserved under layers of compacted mud. How could this have happened everywhere, almost simultaneously? Could a global catastrophe have reshaped the surface of the Earth and our history along with it? The fourth anomaly lies in the fires. Between 1812 and 1910, the planet's cities burned with suspicious regularity. Great fires erased entire centers. Moscow, New York, Hamburg, San Francisco, Chicago, Toronto, Constantinople. Often, these blazes shared strange characteristics, sky glows described as unnatural, entire blocks melting into ash despite masonry construction, weather records noting electrical storms or unexplained auroras. It's as if fire was the instrument of resetting, purging the remnants of a world that came before. Newspapers of the time describe walls glowing from within, iron bending like wax, and streets turning to glass. Was it simple accident, or evidence of technology beyond our understanding, something that could cleanse a city overnight? The fifth anomaly hides in plain sight: the world's fairs. At first glance, they seem like celebrations of progress, great expositions showcasing the triumph of industrial civilization. But the timeline makes little sense. Consider the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. 600 acres of monumental architecture, electric lights, running fountains, massive domes, and colonnades, all allegedly built in less than 2 years on swampy ground using horse-drawn wagons. And then, as soon as the fair closed, most of it was destroyed or burned. The official reason? They were temporary plaster structures. Yet eyewitnesses described walls of solid stone, intricate plumbing, and acoustics impossible for cheap material. The same happened in Paris, St. Louis, and San Francisco. A pattern emerges. Grand cities appear suddenly, filled with impossible architecture, then vanish. Were these fairs genuine exhibitions, or staged unveilings of rediscovered ruins before they were erased for good? The sixth anomaly concerns population and orphans. The latter half of the 19th century saw waves of orphan trains across the United States, relocating hundreds of thousands of children with no verifiable background. Records of their parents often do not exist. Some theorists suggest these were not mere orphans of poverty, but survivors of something catastrophic, children separated from a vanished generation. Meanwhile, population censuses fluctuate inexplicably. Towns appear in one decade's record and disappear in the next. Their inhabitants migrated, lost, or reclassified. Where did they go? And how do entire families vanish while the infrastructure of their cities remains intact? The seventh anomaly lives in the archives, or rather, in what's missing from them. Blueprints for grand buildings vanish. Construction records end abruptly. Government documents between 1850 and 1900 are riddled with gaps, fires, and lost collections. In some cases, entire libraries burn, such as the 1871 Chicago Public Library fire, conveniently destroying historical accounts just as the new city rose. This selective amnesia, repeated globally, gives the impression of an intentional clearing, as if the old world's paper memory was erased alongside its physical remains. The eighth anomaly hums quietly through early technology. There are reports of electrical lighting decades before Edison's patents, of air-powered trains and wireless energy demonstrations long forgotten. The Paris Exposition of 1889, which introduced the Eiffel Tower, also featured mysterious etheric energy devices that later vanished from records. Were these inventions too advanced, or simply relics of a technology inherited from a civilization that no longer existed? Taken together, these anomalies create a mosaic of contradictions. Each piece alone could be explained: a photographic illusion, a coincidence of style, a fire of misfortune. But together they form a melody too consistent to ignore. Cities built too quickly, populations erased too quietly, technologies appearing too early, records vanishing too neatly. It's as if the 19th century was less a period of creation and more one of restoration, rebuilding on the bones of a forgotten epoch. Pause for a moment and imagine the world if this were true. Imagine walking the streets of a city freshly uncovered from mud, its marble steps worn by feet that never appear in any book. Imagine uncovering a column and calling it neoclassical, unaware it was never modeled after Rome. It was Rome, or something far older, inherited intact. The illusion of progress would crumble, revealing not a straight road of evolution, but a circular path, one civilization rising from the ashes of another, erasing its predecessor to begin anew. Even language bears the trace of that buried world. Reset, rebirth, renaissance. Words of renewal, not invention. They whisper that something ended before us, something vast and unacknowledged. And perhaps, deep down, we've always known. Our cities feel too ancient for their age. Our cathedrals too divine for mere brick and sweat. Our technology too conveniently rediscovered, as if memory itself were staged for repetition. The anomalies don't shout. They hum, like the faint vibration of strings after the bow lifts. And if you listen long enough, you begin to hear a larger pattern forming beneath them, connecting every empty photograph, every buried window, every vanished archive. It is the sound of a civilization pausing, erasing, and beginning again. In the next part, we will follow that hum deeper, into the connecting threads that tie these events across continents and decades. We'll see how fires, fairs, and forgotten orphans might not be isolated tragedies, but orchestrated movements in a single, buried symphony, the Great Reset of the 19th century. The deeper we dig, the more the pattern resists coincidence. At first, these anomalies appear as scattered curiosities. Empty streets here, buried doorways there, a few strange fairs and fires. But once aligned on a timeline, they form something eerily deliberate, like strokes of a brush painting a picture from chaos. Every century tells a story, yet the 19th seems to hum in counterpoint, repeating motifs of creation and destruction in perfect rhythm. Cities burned, rebuilt, photographed empty, and then suddenly filled again, as though a conductor had struck the podium and restarted the score. Let's connect the threads. Between 1812 and 1910, more than 40 of the world's largest cities experienced what official history calls catastrophic urban fires. These include not only Moscow, Chicago, and San Francisco, but lesser-known disasters in Toronto, Constantinople, Dublin, and Stockholm. Many occurred within weeks of celestial events, comets, meteor showers, or magnetic storms noted in period newspapers. Witnesses often described the sky lit as day or the air charged like wire. The fires behaved strangely, melting stone, fusing glass, even turning sand to a vitreous crust. These details suggest not ordinary blazes, but electrical phenomena, something atmospheric, immense, and global. Now layer in the mud flood evidence. In nearly every case, the rebuilding that followed these fires involved excavation. Streets dug deeper, new foundations poured above old ones. It's as though the fires didn't just burn, but buried. Imagine a wave of liquid earth sweeping through cities, half submerging buildings, then hardening. The new streets would simply become the next layer of civilization. The same measurements repeat from St. Petersburg to Seattle. 2 to 3 meters of apparent ground rise, uniform across districts. Could such consistency arise from natural accumulation? Or does it hint at a synchronized event, a sedimentary shroud left by catastrophe? At the same time, the architectural similarity becomes less a coincidence and more a signature. Scholars call it the neoclassical revival. Conspiracy researchers call it the Tartarian footprint. In either case, the duplication is impossible to ignore. Consider the domed courthouses of the American Midwest and the palaces of Eastern Europe. Same proportions, same ornamentation, same inexplicable precision. Builders in small frontier towns somehow replicated techniques requiring massive stone machining and complex geometry. The question isn't only how they did it, but why. Why would an agrarian society, on the edge of its technological infancy, design entire centers in a style reminiscent of ancient Rome with resources far beyond necessity? Unless, of course, they weren't designing, they were inheriting. Now place the world's fairs on this timeline. Starting with London's Crystal Palace in 1851, followed by Paris, Vienna, Chicago, and St. Louis. These exhibitions unfold like coordinated performances, each one unveiling an impossibly grand architectural set, followed by its ritual destruction. The same cycle: sudden construction, brief exhibition, fire or demolition. It's as though the world was staging fragments of a forgotten civilization, allowing the public to walk its halls one last time before erasing them. The White City of Chicago, the Grand Palais of Paris, the Palace of Electricity, all vanished or rebuilt in forms far simpler than their originals. Why build such wonders to destroy them? Or were they remnants uncovered, polished for display, then quietly buried again? If this is the case, the 19th century reads less like an age of invention and more like an archaeological unveiling. Steam power, telegraphy, early electric systems, all these discoveries appear not as sudden leaps, but as rediscoveries, reverse-engineered from relics. When Edison filed his patent in 1879, there already existed public demonstrations of electric lighting in London as early as the 1840s, and legends of perpetual lamps found in sealed tombs date back to antiquity. The leap from torchlight to incandescent bulb should have required a century of experimentation, yet within a few decades the world was wired. Could it be that this knowledge was reawakened, salvaged from the ruins of something far older? Another thread emerges through the population mystery: the missing adults and the surge of children. Orphan trains, foundling homes, and labor colonies mushroomed between 1850 and 1900. The official cause: poverty and urban crowding. Yet census data doesn't align. Some cities reported hundreds of thousands of children with no traceable parents, even as birth and death records remain stable. Where were the families? Where were the graves? If we assume a global catastrophe, be it natural, technological, or deliberate, the sudden appearance of these children might represent survivors of resettlement, their origins erased. Perhaps they were found wandering the ruins of the previous world, too young to remember the event itself. The loss of records fits neatly into this pattern. Fires conveniently consumed archives, libraries, patent offices, and construction ledgers. The Great Library of Chicago, the St. Petersburg Municipal Records, the U.S. Patent Office, all burned between 1865 and 1871. Even the Smithsonian suffered mysterious document losses in the same decades. How many blueprints, maps, and eyewitness reports turned to ash, leaving only the rewritten versions of events we study today? It's as if history itself was curated, pruned to hide the seams. To visualize this pattern, imagine a score sheet. Every fire, flood, or exposition a musical note. Plot them chronologically, and you find an oscillating rhythm. Disaster, rebirth, exhibition, erasure, repeated across continents with almost metronomic precision. The buried symphony that has guided our investigation now becomes literal. Each event is a chord struck to erase one movement and begin another. The conductor, whether nature, man, or something else, remains unseen, but the rhythm is undeniable. Let's consider statistical improbability. For so many fires to occur within decades, across different climates, and target dense city cores, the odds are astronomical. Even more so when each is followed by architectural rebirth in the same style. Add to that the synchronous disappearance of historical data, and the probability of coincidence collapses. What we see instead is pattern, coordination, perhaps even orchestration. Whether human or cosmic, it suggests intent. Skeptics often argue that such theories overestimate humanity's capacity for organization. But what if it wasn't our organization? What if we were merely the inheritors of a self-resetting system, a cyclical civilization that rebuilds upon its own ruins every few centuries? Ancient texts from Sumer to Mesoamerica speak of world ages destroyed by fire, flood, or storms of air. Plato's Atlantis was not just a lost island. It was a metaphor for the cyclical amnesia of mankind. Maybe the 19th century was simply our most recent turn of that wheel, its devastation disguised by the language of progress. Even linguistics holds clues. The very term World's Fair implies something encompassing, almost ritualistic, a world presenting itself anew. In older dialects, fair derives from fera, a Latin root meaning festival or rite. Could these expositions have been global rites of renewal, memorials to a civilization just erased? When the crowds walked the halls of the White City, they were not just spectators. They were pilgrims in the freshly rebuilt temple of the modern world, unknowingly attending the funeral of the old one. Every line of evidence, every surviving photograph, every buried arch begins to align. Fires cleanse, mud buries, orphans repopulate, fairs reintroduce, and then silence. The record begins anew. This rhythm, this eerie consistency, is the pulse of the Great Reset theory. It suggests not a random catastrophe, but a systemic reformatting of civilization itself. Perhaps every few centuries, when the weight of accumulated entropy grows too heavy, the system collapses and restarts, preserving fragments, erasing the rest, a self-correcting mechanism of history. We may never know whether this reset was natural, solar storms, polar shifts, plasma discharges, or engineered by those who understood the cycle and sought to guide its outcome. But the pattern's existence is undeniable, encoded in stone, ash, and photograph. What we call modernity may simply be the most recent verse of an ancient song. And so, the picture sharpens. The fires as erasures, the fairs as unveilings, the orphans as repopulators, and the architecture as lingering notes of a forgotten chord. The world didn't just evolve, it rebooted. We are living in the afterimage of that event, walking atop a stage reset for a new act. In the next part, we'll face the unspoken conclusion that this evidence leads toward the theory that ties it all together, explaining why the 19th century looks like a world resurrected from its own ashes. A hypothesis so staggering that it forces us to ask whether we've been here before, many times, and whether the Great Reset was not an anomaly, but a design. All these clues point to one almost unbelievable conclusion. The 19th century wasn't the dawn of modern civilization. It was the reawakening of one that had already lived, died, and been buried. The empty cities were not built for the first time. They were uncovered. The great fires, the mud floods, the world's fairs, all were stages in a grand process of reclamation. Humanity, or what remained of it, did not start from scratch. It simply repopulated the husk of a lost world. This is the hypothesis most historians refuse to entertain. The notion of a great reset in literal, not metaphorical terms. A systemic erasure, a worldwide cataclysm that cleansed the earth of its previous inhabitants, leaving behind their monumental architecture, their technologies, and fragments of their culture. The survivors, emerging generations later, inherited these silent cities, like children discovering the toys of forgotten giants. They didn't invent, they reinterpreted. They didn't build, they repurposed. And in their confusion, they rewrote history from the fragments they could comprehend. Let us consider what such a reset might look like. Picture a global calamity around the early 1800s, perhaps an atmospheric event, a solar storm, or a series of tectonic discharges that electrified the ground and filled the sky with plasma. The reports of skies glowing red for nights on end, of fire from heaven during city fires, suddenly make sense. The buildings melted not from ordinary heat, but from currents surging through the very earth, liquefying stone and glass. This would have created mud, ash, and electromagnetic storms, burying some regions, vaporizing others. Populations would vanish not through conquest, but through instantaneous, invisible annihilation. What remained were the bones of their cities, half submerged in mud and soot, awaiting rediscovery. As centuries passed, survivors or outsiders stumbled upon these ruins. They cleared streets, repaved roads, built new facades atop old frameworks, and called it progress. The photographs of empty streets may not depict new construction, but the final stages of excavation, cities being reactivated after dormancy. When the first cameras arrived, the world was still half buried, half awake. If this sounds implausible, consider how elegantly it explains the anomalies. The architectural uniformity, because these cities were built by one civilization with shared standards, not dozens of disconnected cultures copying each other. The buried doors and windows, because the ground rose from inundation, not deliberate construction. The fires, because the reset event involved electrical phenomena that scorched the surface globally. The world's fairs, because those who inherited this world sought to present its recovered relics as their own achievements, disguising excavation as invention. And the orphans, because the prior population was decimated, and the new world needed bodies to fill its empty streets. The children were redistributed survivors, stripped of history, assimilated into the narrative of a fresh civilization. This hypothesis transforms everything we know about modernity. It suggests that the steam age, the telegraph, the early experiments with electricity were not products of genius emerging from darkness, but fragments of a salvaged technology. Imagine recovering a half-functioning generator from the ruins, studying it, and rebuilding it piece by piece. The 19th century's sudden explosion of invention would then be nothing more than the rediscovery of what had been lost in the reset. The idea is staggering, but so is the evidence. The world's fairs stand as monuments to this deception. Consider Chicago's White City again. Its builders allegedly completed hundreds of palatial buildings, canals, and power systems within 2 years, in a city still recovering from fire and economic depression. Eyewitnesses marveled not at the speed of construction, but at the beauty and age of the architecture. Some called it too perfect, others impossibly ancient. When the fair ended, most of it was destroyed, conveniently removing any chance of deeper inspection. The same sequence repeats in St. Louis, Paris, and San Francisco. These weren't temporary stages. They were the unveiled relics of the old world, exhibited under the banner of progress, then erased before anyone could ask the wrong questions. Even the choice of names betrays the truth. Columbian Exposition, World's Fair. Exposition Universelle. The word exposition means both display and exposure. To expose, to uncover. These were not mere fairs, they were unveilings, humanity displaying the rediscovered fragments of the civilization that came before, pretending they were its own creation. The Great Reset theory also aligns with the mysterious synchronization of urban renewal worldwide. Why did nearly every major city undergo massive reconstruction in the same half-century? London, Paris, Moscow, New York, San Francisco, Tokyo. All modernized simultaneously, all burying or destroying their oldest quarters. The official reason is urban hygiene, yet the visual evidence suggests otherwise. Workers digging out facades, unearthing buried floors, raising streets to match new ground levels. It looks less like modernization and more like reclamation, scraping away mud and decay from the remains of a global cataclysm. Critics might argue that such a reset would have left unambiguous geological evidence. But what if it did, and we simply misread it? The 19th century also saw sudden spikes in atmospheric anomalies, recorded auroras, and magnetic field disturbances. The Carrington event of 1859 being the most famous. A solar outburst so intense it set telegraph lines aflame across continents. If one such event could paralyze technology, what might a greater one do to an entire civilization dependent on an energy grid we no longer understand? It could reset not just power, but memory itself, destroying archives, erasing continuity, forcing survivors to rebuild in ignorance. In this interpretation, Tartaria, that enigmatic empire vanishing from maps around 1850, is not a myth, but the last political echo of that old world. Its architecture, visible from the Kremlin to Kansas, was not coincidence, but inheritance. Its erasure from maps aligns perfectly with the fires and fairs. A civilization erased from memory, its structures rebranded as Western neoclassical, its technologies called inventions, its people reduced to orphans. Think again of the metaphor we've carried through this journey. A buried symphony. Each city, each building, each photograph is a note from that older composition. When the reset struck, the music stopped mid-measure. Generations later, we began to play again, believing we had written a new song. But the melody was already there, etched into the marble, encoded in the geometry of domes, humming faintly in the current of rediscovered electricity. To accept this theory is to accept that we are not the first modern civilization, that our ancestors may have mastered forms of energy, architecture, and organization equal to or greater than ours. That history is cyclical, not linear, an endless rising and falling of civilizations, each one inheriting the ruins of the last. The 19th century's empty cities, then, are not mistakes of photography. They are evidence of transition. The moment the orchestra lifted its instruments once more, unaware the previous movement had ended long before. And if resets are cyclical, it raises a final question, one that haunts every line of this hypothesis. If the last great reset occurred little more than 2 centuries ago, are we approaching the next one? Will our skyscrapers, our grids, our data centers become the silent streets of tomorrow's empty cities? For now, all we can do is listen to the echoes in stone, to the buried hum beneath the foundations of our world, to the faint melody that began long before we thought history began at all. In the next part, we'll confront the skepticism head-on, examining the counter-arguments, the physical evidence that both challenges and strengthens this theory, and the strange coincidences that make denial increasingly difficult. Because if the Great Reset truly happened, traces of it must remain. And perhaps we've been walking over them all along. Every extraordinary theory demands extraordinary evidence. The idea of a Great Reset, of an entire world, civilization wiped and rewritten only 2 centuries ago, challenges the very scaffolding of accepted history. Skeptics call it fantasy, born of photographic quirks and architectural coincidence. Yet, the deeper we look, the more that skepticism begins to sound like denial. For buried beneath the dust of archives and under the pavements of our oldest cities lie patterns that are too consistent, too global, too deliberate to ignore. Let us begin with physical evidence, the kind that resists opinion. In cities as far apart as Edinburgh, Istanbul, St. Petersburg, Mexico City, and San Francisco, we find architectural strata that should not exist. Streets built atop earlier streets, doors opening into soil, windows that once faced daylight now buried beneath the ground. In St. Petersburg alone, entire floors of classical buildings lie under the current sidewalk level, still decorated, still symmetrical, as if no one expected them to be underground. The official explanation says the city sank into its own marsh foundation. But then, why do we see the same phenomenon on high ground in Prague, or the slopes of Lisbon, or the hills of Seattle? Soil accumulation is slow, uneven, and local. Yet this burial is uniform, consistent in depth, synchronized across continents. The odds defy geology. They fit catastrophe. Consider the Chicago excavation photographs from the late 19th century, massive stone foundations being dug out, workers unearthing entire streets from mud, as if restoring a lost layer. Newspapers of the time describe raising the city. But the method is telling. Buildings were not built upward, but excavated downward. Chicago was not raised. It was rediscovered. The same pattern echoes in Europe after the Great Fires. Rebuilding often meant cleaning mud from ornate facades, not erecting them from scratch. Then there are the architectural impossibilities. In 1888, the St. Paul Cathedral in Minnesota was completed in 4 years. Its domes required the movement of thousands of tons of granite by horse-drawn wagons in a region without quarries or rail access. In 1871, the Singer Building rose in New York, its iron skeleton prefabricated with mathematical precision before the modern blueprinting system even existed. The technological curve of the 19th century rises too steeply. Between 1840 and 1890, humanity allegedly leapt from candlelight to electricity, from horse carts to locomotives, from letters to telegraphs to telephones, all in 2 generations. Such exponential progress suggests not discovery, but recovery. The skeptics' strongest argument is the photography explanation. They insist the empty streets were caused by long exposure times, that people were there but blurred away. A fair claim until you examine the details. Exposure lengths by the 1870s were as low as 2 seconds. In that time, a carriage crossing the frame should leave a smear, a walking figure, a faint shadow. Yet many cityscapes show neither. More curiously, certain images show carriages parked mid-street, their horses rigid, reins taut, but still no driver, no pedestrian, no sign of life. Even if we accept long exposure as the cause, why did photographers repeatedly choose to capture their cities at their most lifeless? Why are there thousands of such images across dozens of countries, all depicting the same uncanny silence? Another common rebuttal: the architecture looks similar because nations copied each other. But replication requires communication, shared blueprints, and decades of training artisans in foreign techniques. How, then, did provincial American towns in the 1860s erect buildings identical in detail to those in Warsaw, Milan, or Vienna before the age of instant global information exchange? Even more striking, why are the measurements of doorways, column ratios, and window arches consistent to the millimeter between structures allegedly built by different cultures? Such precision implies a standard, a blueprinting system common to all. Yet, no such global standard existed, unless the builders were not designing from imagination, but restoring from a shared template, following the skeletons of something pre-existing. Let us now turn to electrical evidence, often ignored because it seems impossible. Reports from the 1840s to 1880s mention mysterious lights illuminating public squares decades before Edison's patent. The 1851 London exhibition displayed devices described as self-luminous globes, powered by etheric currents. Similar accounts appear in the St. Louis Exposition of 1904 and the Paris Exposition of 1889. Witnesses describe buildings lit without visible wires. When asked for demonstration afterward, inventors vanished, and the devices were never seen again. Such anecdotes, dismissed as exaggeration, take on new weight if we imagine they were remnants of the old world's surviving technology. Temporary flickers of a knowledge soon buried again. One of the most compelling proofs may be linguistic. The word reset itself entered English lexicon in the early 1800s, derived from resetare, to restore, to replace, to put back into use. It was first used not in mechanics, but in law, describing the act of returning stolen goods to their rightful owner. Was this choice accidental? Or did those who coined it sense the deeper meaning, that society itself was being reset, restored to a prior state after a theft of memory? Critics also argue that a catastrophe of such scale would leave unambiguous written testimony. Yet the 19th century's record-keeping is riddled with sudden fires, lost archives, and unexplained gaps. The U.S. Patent Office burned twice, erasing hundreds of early technology filings. The Moscow archives lost centuries of records in 1812. The Library of Congress caught fire in 1851, destroying nearly all documents predating the 1820s. How convenient that the world's historical documentation resets at the exact moment the physical world begins its reconstruction. We are told to call this coincidence. But what is coincidence repeated 100 times, if not choreography? Of course, we must admit the weaknesses in the hypothesis too. No definitive artifact yet proves an 18th century apocalypse. Geological cores show no global mud layer from that era, and radiometric dating supports gradual urban sediment buildup. But these counter-arguments rely on surface samples, those accessible to contemporary urban archaeologists who rarely dig beneath city centers. What if the evidence lies deeper, in strata sealed by concrete and asphalt, too politically and economically inconvenient to disturb? The modern city, in a sense, entombs its own prehistory. Even the scientific establishment acknowledges unexplained anomalies. The Carrington event of 1859 remains the most powerful solar storm ever recorded. It induced currents strong enough to ignite telegraph lines, primitive wires, yet globally connected. Some scientists speculate that such an event, magnified several-fold, could trigger continent-wide fires, electrical discharges, even spontaneous combustion of infrastructure. Combine that with evidence of atmospheric changes, sudden dips in carbon isotopes, auroral activity visible in tropical latitudes, and the scenario begins to align. Perhaps the Great Reset was not mythic, but electromagnetic, nature's own reboot. In defending the theory, we must also confront our psychological resistance. Humans crave continuity. We measure safety through stable timelines. The notion that our civilization might be one layer in a repeating cycle feels intolerable. It reduces our achievements to echoes. Yet every fossil, every ruin, every myth of flood and fire reminds us. The Earth forgets easily, and it has done so many times before. If one such cycle occurred within the last few centuries, would we even recognize it? Or would we, like those before us, bury the evidence beneath new streets and call it progress? Skepticism is vital, but so is humility. When confronted with anomalies that defy the official story, the rational mind should ask, not dismiss. Perhaps the truth lies between the extremes, not a deliberate conspiracy, nor a perfect cover-up, but a collective amnesia. Maybe our ancestors stumbled upon remnants of a lost civilization, misunderstood what they found, and wrote history backward to make sense of it. The Great Reset, then, may not have been a single event, but a process, a gradual rediscovery of a buried world disguised as invention. In the end, evidence speaks through consistency. The buried floors, the empty photographs, the lost records, the simultaneous fires, all play the same note. And when that note resonates across continents, we are compelled to listen. Whether we call it the Great Reset, the Mud Flood, or the Silent Inheritance, something happened in the 19th century that rewrote our story. The question is not whether it happened, but why it was hidden, and by whom. In the next part, we will step beyond evidence into implication, into the philosophical gravity of what it means if this hypothesis is true. Because if we truly are the inheritors of a lost world, then the real mystery is not what they built, but why they fell. And perhaps whether we are about to repeat their fate. If the Great Reset truly happened, if we are living among the ruins of another civilization's world, then the question shifts from how it happened to why. What kind of system could erase its own memory so completely, leaving only bones of stone and faint electromagnetic ghosts in the air? And more importantly, what does that mean for us now? Let's imagine for a moment that this hypothesis is not just a metaphor, but truth. That humanity in the 19th century didn't rise from nothing, but woke up inside a half-forgotten city, surrounded by technologies it no longer understood. Imagine being one of those early engineers or architects, dusting off an intricate mechanism and pretending you'd invented it. Imagine discovering great halls, domes, aqueducts, and electric fixtures buried in mud, and rather than confessing ignorance, you declared them your creations. What would that do to a culture's psychology? To its pride? Perhaps this explains the almost religious obsession with progress during that era, the feverish need to declare everything new, modern, revolutionary. Because deep down, the world was trying to bury the shame of not knowing where it had come from. This idea, the amnesia of civilizations, has haunted philosophers for millennia. Plato spoke of cycles, of worlds destroyed by water and fire, of societies reborn with no memory of the last. Hindu cosmology describes the kalpas, infinite ages of creation and dissolution. Even the Bible begins with a reset, a flood, washing away the world, sparing only fragments to begin again. What if these were not myths, but memories, encoded across generations as allegory because direct knowledge was impossible? If the Great Reset was merely the latest turn of that wheel, then every civilization we admire, the Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Mayans, may not have vanished by chance. They may have fallen victim to the same mechanism that reset the 19th century world. In this light, the 19th century becomes a mirror, showing us the nature of our own time, because the same signs seem to be returning. Atmospheric anomalies, solar activity intensifying, magnetic poles drifting faster than predicted. Our obsession with digital preservation, a desperate attempt to escape the next amnesia. Are we unconsciously preparing for the next reset, the next erasure? Maybe we sense it in our bones, the echo of cycles older than any chronicle. Maybe that's why our culture compulsively records, archives, and photographs everything, as if fearing that one day it will all vanish again. There is another layer, more psychological, almost spiritual. If humanity indeed inherited a forgotten world, then the truth of our identity becomes fragile. We are not the culmination of a grand story. but children who found a library without understanding the language of its books. Our skyscrapers might stand on the foundations of temples whose gods we no longer remember. Our electrical grids could be the faint reflection of an ancient technology once capable of harnessing the very forces of the atmosphere. The idea that history is not linear but cyclical doesn't just rewrite textbooks. It humbles us. It means progress is not ascent, but rotation. It means that every time we think we've reached the peak, we are only walking an old path again. The implications stretch beyond curiosity. They strike at the core of civilization's purpose. If resets are real, then permanence is an illusion. Empires, nations, technologies all rise knowing they will one day fall, perhaps forgotten within a single generation. The ego of progress collapses into something quieter, more contemplative. Perhaps that's why remnants of the old world feel so hauntingly familiar. They speak not to intellect, but to memory. The marble arches, the impossible domes, the silent cathedrals. Our ancestors didn't build them, but we remember them. On some deep genetic level, we recognize their geometry as if recalling a dream. The resonance of proportions, the pull of symmetry. It is the language of a civilization our DNA still knows. And then there is the question of intent. Was the Great Reset purely natural, a planetary purge? Or was it orchestrated by intelligence? A design woven into the world's fabric, ensuring that no civilization grows indefinitely? Some theorists speak of a self-regulating mechanism, a cosmic safeguard that resets the system when imbalance becomes too great. In other words, civilization may be programmed to forget, to begin again lighter, cleansed of its corruption. From this view, the Great Reset is not tragedy, but renewal, the Earth's way of maintaining equilibrium. It may even explain the mythic symbolism of fire and flood, the elements of purification, not destruction. Yet if that's true, what role do we play? Are we victims of the cycle, or its instruments? When we build new towers upon old foundations, are we rebuilding the past, or are we fulfilling the next stage of the same pattern? It's tempting to think we can break free, that our digital age will preserve us beyond forgetting. But perhaps this too is part of the illusion. The more data we store, the more fragile we become. A single electromagnetic pulse, a modern Carrington event, could erase centuries of knowledge in seconds, resetting us again. The silence of the 19th century photographs may one day mirror the silence after our own collapse. Empty streets, glass towers still standing, networks gone dark. Maybe that's why the truth of the Great Reset feels dangerous. It erodes the foundations of control. Governments, academia, and religion depend on continuity, on the belief that history is knowable, stable, ordered. To accept cyclical resets is to accept that authority, too, is temporary. That no institution, however powerful, escapes erasure. The suppression of this theory, if intentional, may not be about hiding a conspiracy, but preserving meaning. Because if people understood that civilizations reset like seasons, what purpose would empire or progress hold? Perhaps silence is not deception, it's survival. There is, however, another possibility, one more hopeful. Maybe the Great Reset was not punishment or cosmic accident. Maybe it was opportunity, a deliberate clearing of the slate, giving humanity another chance to begin with less weight, fewer mistakes. After every collapse, knowledge fragments, but wisdom, true wisdom, survives in symbols, art, intuition. That's why, across all cultures, we find the same archetypes: the phoenix, the spiral, the wheel, the Ouroboros. These are not mere decorations. They are instructions. They remind us that what ends will begin again, and what is forgotten will one day be remembered. If so, then the 19th century's silence was not the end of something, but the breath before the next note. The buried symphony paused, waiting for new hands to lift the bow. And now, perhaps, it is playing again. Every rediscovered photograph, Every excavated doorway, every anomaly we unearth, adds another note back to the score. Slowly, the melody of the old world returns, not to frighten us, but to teach us. And yet, there is a melancholy beauty in this realization. If resets are inevitable, then what matters is not permanence, but awareness. To know that everything we build will one day be dust. Yet to build with grace anyway, that may be the closest we come to immortality. The architects of the Forgotten Age might have understood this. Their structures endure not because they defied time, but because they harmonized with it. Their geometry, aligned to celestial ratios, made peace with the cycle. They didn't build to last, they built to return. So perhaps the Great Reset is not a secret to fear, but a rhythm to remember. We are not its victims, we are its participants. Every invention, every rediscovery, every attempt to connect heaven and earth through technology or architecture is our subconscious way of remembering the song. A song older than the pyramids, older than language, still echoing beneath our feet. In the next and final part, we will draw the threads together, revisiting what we've uncovered and asking one final question. If the buried symphony truly plays on, what will our verse sound like when the next silence comes? We began with a simple question. Why are so many 19th century cities empty in their earliest photographs? But as we followed the trail through mud, fire, and silence, that question opened into something far larger. It became a mirror, reflecting not just a century, but an entire cycle of human existence. Along the way, we found evidence of erasure. Buried windows, impossible architecture, vanished archives, and the haunting synchronization of global catastrophes. We heard echoes of a buried symphony, its melody scattered in the stones of forgotten cities, and the static hum of rediscovered electricity. And now, standing at the edge of this revelation, one truth remains. Our history, as we've been taught, may not be a straight line, but a spiral. The pattern of destruction and rebirth appears too consistent to be accidental. Civilization rises, perfects itself, forgets its humility, and is swept away, only to rise again upon its own ruins. The 19th century may have been one such turning, a reset both physical and spiritual. The fires, the fairs, the orphans, the blank photographs. They are not disconnected curiosities, but fragments of a single transition. They mark the handover between two worlds, the last echoes of an older civilization and the tentative breath of ours. What we call the modern age may be less an age of creation than of remembrance, and that, perhaps, is the most unsettling thought of all. Because if this pattern holds, then we are not the first to stand where we stand now. Others have built towers that pierced the sky, systems that connected continents, archives that contained all knowledge. And others have watched those towers crumble, those systems flicker, those archives burn. Each thought itself the pinnacle. Each fell silent when the reset came. If we listen closely, the emptiness in those 19th century streets begins to sound like a prophecy, a warning encoded in stone and soot. Look around our own cities today. At night, the high-rises glow like modern cathedrals, their windows flickering with the same sterile light that once illuminated the white city of Chicago. We pride ourselves on progress, yet our architecture mimics the same proportions, the same symmetry, the same compulsion for monumental design. We are repeating the rhythm without knowing the melody. Even our technology follows the old curve. First wonder, then ubiquity, then dependence. We talk of digital immortality, of storing consciousness in silicon. But all it would take is one global pulse, one electromagnetic breath of the sun, and every server, every archive, every memory would vanish, just as the records of the old world did. Perhaps this is the real meaning of the Great Reset, not a conspiracy of men, but a law of nature. A cosmic metronome keeping time, reminding each age that knowledge without wisdom collapses under its own weight. The mud, floods, and fires were not punishments, but symptoms, the physical expression of imbalance. Our own era has its equivalents: rising seas, technological overreach, social fracture, spiritual amnesia. The cycle approaches again, the orchestra tuning for the next movement. Whether it ends in silence or renewal depends on whether we finally learn the lesson buried beneath those empty streets. But what, then, is that lesson? Maybe it is that memory itself is sacred, that the greatest tragedy of each reset is not the loss of stone or steel, but of meaning. When we forget where we came from, we are doomed to rebuild without understanding why. The ancients knew this. They carved their knowledge into monuments aligned with stars, encoded it in myth so it could survive the next deluge. The builders of the old world, too, tried to preserve harmony and form, embedding sacred geometry into their cities so that even in ruin they would still sing the truth. They left us not instructions, but resonance, the faint hum of a frequency our souls still recognize, if we would only stop long enough to listen. And maybe that's where our task begins. To remember, not through blind faith in textbooks, nor through the fever of conspiracy, but through awareness. To look at our world and question what we take for granted. To see architecture not as decoration, but as communication. To treat old photographs not as curiosities, but as messages from another time. Every column, every dome, every buried doorway is a fragment of our own story, calling us back to coherence. If we can learn to read the signs, to listen for the buried symphony, perhaps we can break the cycle, or at least meet the next reset with eyes open. Because knowledge, after all, is not what saves civilizations. Consciousness does. The recognition that we are part of a pattern does not doom us. It gives us choice. The 19th century may have been the last whisper of an age that forgot its song. We do not have to be the next. We can build differently, not in arrogance, but in alignment. We can choose architecture that harmonizes with the world instead of conquering it, technology that preserves memory rather than erasing it, education that awakens wonder instead of repetition. If there is a purpose to uncovering the Great Reset, it is not to point fingers at lost empires. It is to remember that we too are temporary, and that within that impermanence lies grace. So the next time you walk through your city, past the facades that seem older than they should, past the ornate windows half buried in asphalt, past the cathedrals whose builders no one remembers, pause, look closer, listen. You may feel something beneath your feet, a low vibration, a hum that has nothing to do with traffic or trains. That's the buried symphony, still playing faintly through the bones of the earth. It's what connected the old world to ours, and what may one day connect ours to the next. Perhaps that's the true purpose of the archivist's search, not to expose a cover-up, but to remind us that history is alive, breathing, cyclical. We are not its end, only its current verse. Each photograph, each anomaly, each rediscovered pattern is a note from the last civilization reaching across time, asking us not to repeat their silence. Whether we answer that call will determine the song our descendants inherit. So, as we close this investigation, take a moment to feel the weight of everything we've uncovered. The fires, the mud, the empty cities, the orphans, the forgotten brilliance, they all lead to this: an invitation to listen, to remember, to live consciously in a world that may one day forget itself again. And if the buried symphony still plays, then the next movement has yet to be written. Perhaps it begins with you, here, now, listening to these words, questioning the story you were told. Because every great rediscovery begins the same way, with someone willing to ask what others refuse to see. Our exploration may end here, but the search continues. There are still unexamined streets, untold stories, unplayed notes in the grand score of human history. If you wish to keep uncovering them, to keep listening for the echoes of forgotten worlds, Then stay with us. Subscribe, so that when the next piece of this vast puzzle emerges, you'll be among the first to hear it. After all, history isn't something we inherit. It's something we remember together. And the symphony isn't over. It's only waiting for the next note.